Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Ratliff Mandolins Weekly Production Diary. And I am going to start this week's episode with a little bit of a talk about this 1925 Gibson L3 guitar that belongs to me. It's been in the family for as long as I can remember, and it needed a little bit of tender, loving care in the way of some binding being re-glued. And a couple of places, 3 or 4 different places that needed the binding re-glued. And then basically all it really needs is just a nice clean up, polish, and new strings and that sort of thing. So I have decided to spend a few minutes every morning just doing that very thing so that we can put some strings back on this guitar and maybe sell it, I'm thinking about. Yesterday I polished the back out, cleaned it up really good. Took me about 45 minutes. And this morning, I think I'll just pick a one job and do that and set it aside and go to work in the big room where we are building a batch of 10 mandolins. So today I will probably think just work on the bass side of the sides. I'm going to do just this from here to here, and then I'll set this thing down and come back to it tomorrow. So for the next half hour or so, I am going to do nothing but polish the bass side of this guitar. Okay, that's all I'm going to do for the guitar today. I have cleaned this bass side up, and I'll come back and pick up where I left off tomorrow. But for now, we'll go in the big room, and I will show you what's going on in there. So let me explain that we've got the beginnings of the next 10 mandolins started. Actually, I have 14 backs that I'm joining together, and then I've got a whole pile of sides that I'm going to be bending into sides, mandolin molds. And so I'll just run some footage now of me joining these backs and then bending a few sides and putting those sides pieces into the molds. And now we're going to bend some sides. Now, as many of you know, I have this table type thing that I built here that's got the molds for each piece of the sides that go on an F-style mandolin. And last week I got an email from a viewer who is building his own mandolin and had built a similar thing to this one right here that I have. This is the mold that I used, and I use to make this piece right here, which is this piece on the mandolin. So he had an aluminum form that he heated up on a heating element, very much like what I've got, and it had cracked back here on in these bends right here, which happens sometimes. And he had sent me a video of him actually bending the sides and wanted to know my thoughts and comments and whether he could salvage that and that sort of thing. So I thought the best thing to do would probably be just bend that very piece right here and tell you about what I'm doing as I'm doing it. Now we're going to start off with discussing wood preparation. I try to get the wood as smooth, not necessarily as smooth as possible, but down to at least 80 if not 100 grit. Round the edges off just a little bit, because I found that if it's going to start to splinter off, quite often it'll be on those really sharp edges. And you have to kind of look at the board and see how thin to get it. But I usually shoot for 100 tenth of an inch, 100 thousandths, 105, 106 thousandths, something like that. And I've found that the best bending woods are either no curl whatsoever or really tight curl. Where it wants to break a lot is where you have fairly broad curl. You know, the curl that's every half inch, 3/8 of an inch or half an inch between stripes. That's the stuff that gets pretty hard to bend around these really tight curves, especially the scroll area and this piece here and these parts of this piece will tend to break on the stuff that has a big, broad curl. The next thing is the heat of the iron, bending iron itself. I usually test it, and I've actually timed these things, so I know this mold right here takes about 21 minutes to heat up. This one takes about 14 and a half or 15 minutes to heat up. And the little one for this curve takes only about 6 or 7 minutes to heat up. So I know about how much. I set a timer actually, but I got all of those figures and numbers by just using it over and over again and watching my watch and everything. The main thing is to get this thing as hot as it can be before it'll burn the wood. And that seems to be when I put a drop of water on it and the water immediately sizzles. Sometimes, and once it gets pretty hot, you put that water on there, and just a drop of water, I put it on my fingers and just splatter it on there. That water will lay there for a second or 2 or 3 seconds, and then it'll start boiling off. That's not hot enough. I want to fling that water on there, and it just immediately skitters right off the top of the plate. And I'll do that for both pieces of this mold. This mold is actually 2 pieces, a male and a female. And so the only way to heat them up is to put the big part of the mold on the eye, and then this smaller piece out here, as you'll see when we run some footage of it here in just a second, it heats just by the heat transferring from one to the other. So I got to get both pieces where that stuff will just skitter off, where the water will just skitter off of that. So 100 and not 1/8 of an inch, not that thick, 100 thousandths, 105, something like that. Get it pretty smooth, pretty slick. I don't really soak these things in water at all, I'll just step into the bathroom and run them under the sink just before I put them in the mold. I don't like to soak them. They seem like they split easier if they've been soaked overnight. They'll actually break, seems like, easier than if you just try to bend them more or less dry with just some surface water on them. Heat the mold up really good and hot. And so we're going to take this piece of wood right here that's been prepared exactly like I've described, and we're going to bend this. So, right now. I failed to mention it earlier, but we'll put this long straight piece of wood, once we get these two irons heated up, this long piece of wood will just slip right in here like this, and then we'll start cranking this stuff down. Now what I try to do is keep these sides parallel as much as I possibly can. And then the big thing is I will just kind of rock this mold in by going a quarter of a turn at a time. You can't go too fast. Quarter of a turn, quarter of a turn, quarter of a turn, quarter of a turn, and rock it all the way in until the two halves are tight. Just like that right there. So that was the one thing that I should have mentioned earlier. You can't bend it too fast. Now here's an example of the water being too slow to boil off. See, that iron is not hot enough just yet. Now I mentioned earlier that we have to get both sides of the mold hot enough to do the job, and here's a perfect example. See how quickly that water is boiling off. However, that water is just staying there. So this side of this mold is not hot enough to do the job yet. We have to get both sides where they'll do that right there. And when the other side of the heater gets hot enough to do the job, we're going to take this piece of wood. This is the one I've been using to just dip in the water and show you what I was talking about. We will wet this thing all the way down by running it under the bathroom faucet, and we'll bend it. Okay, I think it's hot enough now. I'm going to put some gloves on because, as you can imagine, that thing is very hot and I don't want to touch it. I'm gonna get these things apart enough to slip that straight board in. That tip to go right there in that notch, and then we're gonna just very, very slowly parallel those jaws up and start bringing things in a quarter of a turn at a time. Quarter of a turn, quarter of a turn, very slowly. I'm in no hurry. If you go too fast, you will indeed break it. I don't know if you can hear it on the video or not, but it's raining pretty heavy outside right now. There we go. We are done, and it is bent. And now we'll just take this thing off of the heating element and hang it on the wall. and let it cool off. And as a point of interest, I guess, this thing will retain heat and still be hot for 2 hours. All of these will. Well, that little one won't quite as long, but these two big ones, they stay hot for an amazingly long time. And we'll take this one. And now we'll bend that big long one. It is now Friday in the late afternoon, not too far from quitting time, and I thought I would stop for a moment and share with you all of the things that basically got done around the shop this week, sort of have a review. Number one, this guitar. I worked on it a little bit every morning, and this morning I got as far as putting the tailpiece on. I glued the nut back in and got the first string put on it before I kind of ran out of time. I said, okay, I'm already over my allotted time. I'm gonna quit and try to get strings and tune this thing up on Monday. The second thing that we got done was I bent sides, of course, all week. Number one, I had one of the side benders break, and it took me about 2 hours to get it fixed one day, but I did get it fixed. And so we bent sides. I've actually run those benders 3 days this week, and I got one of the sets of sides with all of the blocks glued in, and it's ready for the next step in the construction phase, which is to level the tops and bottoms and get the kerfing put in and the corner protectors. So we are making some progress with the side bending. And of course, I think the biggest thing that I got done this week was I glued up all of the back halves. In fact, I actually went upstairs and pulled another smaller board and got 2 back halves out of that and glued those together as well. So I have a whole pile of backs and 4 or 5 tops that have been glued together. They were glued together months ago. And so that's what we're going to be doing next week. We'll be sawing those into profile, which I did get some of those, as you can see, sawed into profile already this week. And next week we'll be sawing the rest of them into profile and maybe starting the carving process for those. So that's all we got done this week. Come back next week for the next exciting episode of the Ratliff Mandolins weekly production diary. I hope to see you then. And until then, my name is Audie Ratliff. Thank you so very much for sticking with me to the very end. Hit the like and subscribe, send a link to your friends, all those kind of things. And we'll see you next time on the Ratliff Mandolins weekly production diary. Bye.